I can now see the recording light, so let's continue and let's keep our eye on that recording light as we go.
Thank you. Thank you, Lori, for reminding us of that as well. Starting with the CalAPA overview, this is our 10,000 foot level on what Cycle 3 is about. From your next slide, please. So our CalAPA has 3 leadership cycles. The first one deals with data, using data, analyzing data to inform both school improvement and to promote equity. The second leadership cycle is about leadership of your peers or colleagues, and its title is Facilitating Communities of Practice. And then the third one, the one we're looking at today, is supporting teacher growth through a coaching cycle, not necessarily an evaluation cycle, but a coaching cycle to improve classroom practice. All 3 of our cycles use a reiterative step-by-step guide. We start with the investigate here at the top of our diamond, then move over to plan, then act, and then moving over to reflect. As we talk today, we will be using these as our frame to walk you through each of those steps. Next slide, please. One of the nice things about the assessment guide is it gives you different angles, different ways to look at the cycle itself. So we start first with the overview, which is really a 10,000 foot level. It's a 1-pager that gives you a very quick analysis of what the steps are. And then right after it is an evidence table. It is a 3-columned table that provides the elements in the left column. Step by step, what other pieces will be in the middle column. And then on the far right, the evidence that will be submitted and judged in our rubrics for that particular step. And we really encourage you to find creative ways to cover this material with candidates before you move into the actual details of the cycle. For instance, you could have candidates individually read the overview, so we make sure everyone has that information. Have them create posters or 1-pagers of the evidence guide, and perhaps even break up into small groups to outline steps about the rest of the step-by-step cycles for the rest of the class. Something hands-on for each of them so they get familiar with the cycle steps as well. A couple of other tips for introducing a cycle, because they're all different. The assessment guide has blue call-out boxes, is what we call them, and these provide very important details that illuminates the requirements of the cycle. So bringing the candidate's attention to the blue call-out boxes will help them in getting quality submissions prepared. Secondly, I would introduce the candidates to a rubric-based scoring system. Make sure they understand some of the structures that we use in a rubric system. So first of all, what is a level? How is the rubric itself structured? There's an essential question. What is the purpose of the essential question and how it relates to our level 3? Throughout our rubrics, you will see the ands or ors bolded, and they have different meanings to explain to candidates that ands versus ors are very important for them to pay attention with. And then in our rubrics, you will see a sentence and then a space and then another sentence. We call each of those little pieces of text a construct. So defining constructs and asking the candidate to pay attention to each one of those constructs becomes very important. And then finally, the footer of each of our rubrics has very important information. It includes not only the performance expectation that is being covered, but also the evidence pieces that they are going to be using for this rubric. So they keep their focus very narrowed to the assessment materials that are being used. And then finally, we have a graphic for, we built a graphic for us to use today that just shows in a visual format what are the steps for this cycle, that a little footbridge. So as we prepare for a classroom lesson, The lesson is the bridge, and then looking at the lesson and analyzing it and looking at practice, both for the volunteer teacher and the candidate as a leader, would be a way to look through the steps of this cycle. And Marco will be building this as we go along, so you'll see this cycle again and again, but just know it's like an overall visual picture.
Great, thank you, Gay, for getting us squared away there. We're going to go ahead now and jump into the guide itself, CalAPA Cycle 3, Supporting Teacher Growth. So please do make sure you have the copy of the guide out and you have a highlighter or you have it pulled up on your screen and you can follow along. We do want to let you all know, just in case you're wondering, we will be posting this on our YouTube channel at the conclusion of this presentation. It'll take a few days, but we will have this posted for you to return to in case you need to review any material we present today. So this is the front cover of our guide. And what's important about the front cover of our assessment guides is this important red text down here. And what's important about this is that we promised when we first developed these performance assessments that if we found through our survey research with candidates, program faculty, coordinators, and others, our assessors, that we needed to clarify or better align or add words to the glossary, that we would do that, and that these would not be static documents produced and put in place and kept there for 10 years, but that we would work on them year to year as we receive feedback from you. So very important to note that we put version control numbers on the front covers. This happens to be version 03. So this is the third version of the guide. And you will want to check to make sure you and your candidates are in the right version of the guide. It is to the candidates' advantage to make sure they have the most up-to-date materials. Again, these are not deep, serious changes or switches in direction or anything like that, but they are clarifying in the language and we believe a little bit more helpful and supportive to the candidate. So do make sure you're in the right version. This version 03 was published and was sent to candidates when they registered in the online system for the assessment starting in July of 2020. And we reviewed this version of the guide with all of our programs in June of 2020. So hopefully everyone is aware of these slightly revised materials and are good to go for this administration year. So let's keep going. Just to walk us into this document so you understand how it looks. We have a preamble in our document, and it's so important that we want to pause here and make sure that you are all aware of this preamble and that when you're working with your candidates, you also point it out to them. In California, of course, we want effective educational leaders that strive for educational opportunities that are driven by equity and culturally responsive practices, right? To promote each student's academic success and well-being. We need leaders in California that recognize, respect, and utilize each student's strengths, experiences, and backgrounds as assets. So asset approached instructional design for both those lessons and assessments used with students. And we really want to be very careful about institutional bias towards student marginalization. And we do not want deficit-based schooling for our students in California. And we do want high expectations, not low expectations for all of the students that we work with in California. The second paragraph really points out that in the CAPE, in our performance expectations, as well as in these assessment guides, that we use the term all students. And when we use the term all students, we mean all students, all TK-12, TK-22 students that engage in our public systems. We know in our education specialist environments, we often have students that go up to the age of 22. And what this paragraph does is it just sort of lays out here all the kinds of aspects of students that we may be serving in our schools, that diverse range of students with a whole range of learning and behavioral characteristics. And we also want to pay close attention to and support, of course, our students who are English learners, our students who are standard English learners, and of course be very inclusive of all of our students who have specialized needs in any way, and to make sure that we are working with all of our students equitably and in an equal manner, and supporting them from that asset-based lens when they come into our classrooms and into our schools. So just wanted to pause and point out this preamble. So the guide goes on then and talks a little bit about, in the next section beyond the table of contents here, just who helped develop these assessments. These were developed with the commission and a very important group of educators on the design team. And that design team, many have come forward and become our lead assessors and have stayed engaged in the work. And we thank all of the educators that worked with us to develop this. And of course, through all of our continued survey research and our assessor work and the engagement of our candidates together as a learning community, we're developing these performance assessments to help guide the development of our leaders for our California schools. So thank you to all of the educators that have been involved. So then that brings us to the important beginning of each leadership cycle. So we have cycle 1, we have cycle 2. Today we're looking at cycle 3, and we start out with an overview of what is expected from the candidate, sort of what is that underlying theory of action, what are we measuring, and we're doing that in 4 steps. The investigate step at that school site, the planning then, the acting on the plan, and finally stepping back, the candidate's asked to reflect on their work in this particular cycle. Remember, cycles are typically 4 to 6 weeks of engagement and work, so they do take time and they need to be planned for. They are embedded assessments, so they're happening in coursework and they're happening in clinical practice. And now, due to COVID, some of our candidates will be completing their work in their first employment positions or in the positions they're currently in on either an eligibility credential and or a preliminary credential. And together as a community of learners, we will all support our candidates. California needs great leaders. The next part of our guide gets us into a short description, narrative description of each step. So you can see here a description for step 1, investigate. Then we go on down and we see a narrative explanation of plan, then act, and then reflect. And we will step through each of these 4 steps with you in great depth as we continue through the guide. So the next thing we see in our guide is the evidence table. This is the quick hand look, the bird's eye view of what is happening in each table. And we provide this because we know some learners really like this very table-oriented format. So what we have here in our evidence table is step 1, investigate. And for all of our candidates, when they go on and register and they get the materials, they're given templates. And the template basically provides the questions that are in the guide. We don't need candidates spending their time retyping questions, so we provide templates. So in step 1, investigate, we have then our middle column of what the candidate needs to do. And you can see the steps bulleted out for the candidates here. And then finally, in our far right column, you can see part A. Part A that needs to be submitted as evidence is a written narrative, and that's that template I was talking about. And in this case, they're looking at providing information about coaching, observation, and or instructional feedback practices at the school site in which they're completing this cycle and doing their work in their preliminary program. And they will be working with a volunteer teacher. This written narrative, you can see right here, it says no more than 5 pages. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well. So you can see, hopefully, as we scroll through here for each step, we talk about the steps. So step 2, plan. Then we have the bulleted set of directions and expectations to the candidate about what they need to do. And then we have the evidence to be submitted. So in step 2, we have part B, written narrative. This is the context, lesson, and observation. No more than 4 pages. Part C, the volunteer teacher's lesson plan, including student work product description, what will happen in that lesson, what will the students be producing, and then part D, annotated video clips. Then we have step 3 and so on. I can go ahead and show them step 4. And then that brings us very specifically into our first narrative description. So now what happens in the guide is each step is kind of discussed in much more detail and depth for the candidate. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Gay, who's going to take us through step 1. And again, we encourage you to put your questions in the chat as we go, and we will respond. So Gay, you want to take us into step 1?
Sure. Step 1 has a couple of Roman numerals or subsections underneath it. The first one talks about current coaching and observation practices at the school. As with all of our cycles, it starts with an investigation as to what currently is. So you will see this first paragraph guides the candidate into looking at specific things. Familiarize yourself with the current practices around coaching, observation, and feedback. Review what is established practice for the classroom observation. How should you collect evidence? What form should be used? Make sure the candidate understands what the CSTP are, as they are the state's measure of classroom performance. There are other measures out there. If the school does not use that, then we'll have to transfer it over to the CSTP, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But it is very crucial that they understand how the CSTP are organized and work. Then they're asked to provide an overview of the process so that they understand what a observation, a pre-observation, and a post-observation is. They will look at the template that is provided in order to answer those questions. And then finally, this is a very important piece, this last sentence of this paragraph, consider how these practices are reflective of current practices or adult learning theory. So although they're just investigating the facts and only the facts, this is crucial that they also put in their opinion of how these practices are reflecting the adult learning theory, what we know about evidence-based practices. And then turning to the template, they will describe the existing practices through 4 questions. The first question is outline how often teachers are coached or they're observed or provided feedback of what the intended outcomes are. After they review those, they provide an analysis of how effective those are. Number 2, they're asked to describe the forms of documents. What's the process that's used to guide the pre-observation meeting? How are they going to collect observation data and focus on the post-observation meeting, looking at goals the teacher might want the candidate to focus on during their observation? And if the school doesn't have any observations or uses a different approach, then you're going to need to provide a detailed description of the approach and the forms that will be used. Number 3 in the template asks that they explain the level of input that teachers on the campus have in regards to their coaching, observation, instructional feedback at the school. Is it something that is done to them? Is it a joint effort? Do they have any selection of the CSTPs they're focused upon? So that's very important. And then again, a warning here in the paragraph between 3 and 4, we're on page 5. Once you have familiarized yourself with the practices, review the CSTPs. Know what their academic and effective elements that are contained therein, and be prepared according to the CSTP that the volunteer teacher selects. Be prepared to discuss and talk them through in relation to the observation that you will be conducting of a single lesson. Number 4 in the template says, how does the CSTP guide or play a role in the teacher's growth or development? And then we come to our first call out box, which is hey, pay attention to me, this is important. If the school uses another set of standards, then the candidate is expected to provide a crosswalk to the CSTP for the elements that have been identified. So you would say in Susie Q's evaluation of teacher observation, this is known as element 42C, but in the CSTP, it will be CSTP 1, sub-element C and D. So something that provides a reference to their language and then into the CSTP language. Roman numeral 2, we're on the top of page 6, talks about the volunteer teacher's context for the coaching cycle. So now that you have understood, the candidate has understood the surrounding school elements, let's talk about the teacher's classroom. So identify a volunteer teacher who's going to participate in this coaching cycle, not evaluation, but coaching. And that will include a classroom teacher. Find the background information about the volunteer teacher. Make sure that you have the permission for the teacher, other adults and students that you're going to be video recording. And finally, use the video recording of the volunteer teacher's lesson to guide your post-observation meeting. Note here, just above the box, they will not be submitting the video recording of the lesson as they see it and observe it, but they will, in the post-observation conference, submit evidence of them watching the video. Our second call-out box is two important pieces. Follow all district policies. You never want to go against what the district says, and make sure that the appropriate permissions have been obtained and are on file. They don't need to be submitted, but the candidate and probably their people guiding them on this cycle should make sure that they are in place. Going back to the template under Roman numeral 2, there are 3 questions that they will be looking at. Number 1 is providing information about that volunteer teacher, things that we have read in that top paragraph, their professional experience as a teacher. Secondly, what is their current assignment? What grade level do they teach, or their content area, or perhaps course title? Thirdly, their past experience with coaching. Have they been observed, or did they get instructional feedback at any time at this school site, perhaps in a previous school site, or during their teacher prep time? Fourthly, what is the knowledge and use of the CSTP for this volunteer teacher? Is it something that is going to be very familiar, hand in glove, or something that needs to be talked about and translated from their use of some kind of measurement tool to the CSTP? Number 2, explain how the information gathered by the candidate about the school context informs their plans for conducting a coaching cycle. So again, a little bit of analysis of what they have found and showing their leadership skills. It's very easy for candidates to fall back into what I am producing is the grade here, not necessarily a grade, but you get the idea. But really, we are looking at their leadership skills. So when it comes to analyzing and getting something down about them, it's very important that they show that they have been reflective and done those steps. So looking at A, did they orient the teacher to the coaching process that they will be engaged in? Did they conduct a pre-observation meeting where they talked about things like the CSTP, the students in the classroom, the context, what's the lessons student product going to be? C, ask for the observation and collection of evidence, such as student work. And then finally, to jointly conduct a post-observation meeting. And I think the word jointly is extremely important there, and I would highlight that, because this is not a dictatorship, but a conversation between two. And it is about engaging the volunteer teacher in a conversation around classroom practice. And then finally, another reflective piece, describe challenges that the candidate is thinking they may face as they conduct a coaching cycle, and provide strategies to address these challenges. Moving on to the top of page 7. The evidence is a one thing here, part A, a written narrative. The narrative will talk about the coaching cycle and feedback practices at the school and the volunteer teacher, and it should be no more than 5 pages. Now I'm going to turn it over to Marco to tell you a little bit of tips on how what he has found in being a lead assessor for this cycle, and what are some best practices.
Thank you so much, Kay, and hello everyone. And thank you for posting in the chat, letting us know about working from home and having your cameras off. I know that for all of us, there's so many challenges now in this new work remotely reality. So I think our neighbor's gardener just stopped using the blower, thankfully, just in time, to eliminate some of the background noise. Hopefully you're all doing well. We're going to go ahead and get started then with step one, which is investigate. Think about this continuous problem-solving cycle that our candidates are going to be engaged in. And so here are some tips that I'll be sharing that may help in helping your candidates maneuver cycle 3 successfully. And so I'll focus on what we're seeing as some patterns on candidates who are scoring higher points on these rubrics as we go. So let's go ahead and move on to our next slide. All right, building a cycle 3 submission. So in this little graphic, you can see our IPAR cycle, our investigate, plan, act, and reflect cycle. And you can see each of these stepstones, right, from getting from the investigate portion down to our reflection. And the bridge in between them is really like our CSTPs that help our candidates maneuver this continuous improvement cycle. And the bridge is also a means for them to go back and forth between this cycle, because there are portions that they have to connect when they reach the action and the reflection piece, connecting it back to the beginning of the cycle. So just kind of think of that bridge as a two-way pathway that they can follow to make these connections. So let's go ahead and move into our next slide. And keeping in mind that even though we have these 4 steps in the cycle, there are seven rubrics that we're using. So some of these steps have more than one rubric that we apply when we're assessing. So let's start to look at step 1, the investigation. And here, the essential question for our candidates is, how do the candidates describe and analyze the current role of teacher coaching and feedback at their school site? And they need to explain the implications for their approach to conducting this coaching cycle. So as you can see, I've lifted 2 of the parts on step 1 that they're asked to look at the coaching and observation practices at their school site, the current ones, and then the volunteer teacher in context. So they're talking about who they've selected as their volunteer teacher, and then what their context is, their role, what they're teaching at the school site. For step 1, there is 1 rubric, and it's worth 5 points. So 5 points for this first part in step 1. So let's move on to our next slide. And we can see that really the rubrics, what's differentiating the different levels from 1 point up to the 5 points, you can see that the candidate, they're asked to list or describe or explain and discuss. So if they do not do some of these things, they're going to score a little lower on this first step. And listing is when the candidate just simply lists what happens at the school site without a deeper description. And so that will score lower points for them. But if they go into a more detailed description or an explanation, and they're talking about how it's differentiated for the different teachers at the school site based on their experience and classes they teach, then they can potentially score higher. So here are some of the keys for our candidates to score better on this first rubric. There is a 5-page limit for step 1. So candidates will stay within the 5 pages. They will not go over. Assessors stop reading and scoring at the 5-page limit. So if they submit 8 pages or 9 pages and it's a great analysis, we will not read those 3 or 4 extra pages. And so they will likely lose points, and depending on some of that information, when it comes in, they could potentially receive a condition code, which we totally want to avoid. So they also will they explain the coaching and the feedback processes at the school site. And we also know, as Gay said earlier, that not every school might be focused on CSTPs. So they will have to crosswalk that and then make sure that they connect that professional learning standard to the CSTP. And for example, the Los Angeles Unified School District uses a teaching and learning framework. Other districts around the state might be using the Danielson framework. So we ask our candidates to make sure that they crosswalk those to the CSTPs. Then thinking about the investigation stage, those 2 parts we talked about, the description of the feedback practices and coaching, and then the teacher context. part one is critical. Part one is really critical to that piece because that's where they're really talking about the current school practices. Part two is also very important, but that's more of a description of the teacher, the classroom, the context. So really focus on that part one, okay? All right, and then Cynthia, I know you're asking about 5 pages included embedded figures tables. It's a 5-page limit total. So, so they cannot go beyond that point. Okay. All right, and let's see. All right, and then part one really is setting up the rest of the steps. So again, that's why they get the 5 pages. So it's very important that they are able to really set this up for the rest of the investigation that they're going to be conducting. Okay. All right, let's go on to our next slide. All right, so now we are going into step 2, the plan, and this is the pre-observation part of the cycle. So we can move on to our next slide. All right, so here in the planning stage, this is the pre-observation cycle, and Gay walked us through some of the components, but I'd like to go back to the PowerPoint just so we can stay on and look at some of the tips there.
Right, so Amy's going to walk us through part 2 first, step 2 first.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you. So let's go ahead and put our attention back on the guide itself. We're now on page 8, step 2 plan. And as Marco pointed out, step 2 also is very important to the overall response here in this cycle. So what the candidate is now doing is conducting that pre-observation meeting with the volunteer teacher. And they're going to conduct and video record the pre-observation meeting to review the learning goals and classroom context, including the teacher's perspective on the context. Very important. So we also recommend that candidates video record the entire meeting so that they have as much opportunity to go back and pick out, in this case, 2 video clips. But in this first step, conducting the pre-observation meeting, we go on and ask the candidate to be very clear about how together the candidate and the volunteer teacher agree on a coaching focus by selecting one element of one of the 6 domains of the California Standards for the Teaching Profession, the document that the Commission on Teacher Credentialing has put forth for what teaching and assessing should look like in California classrooms for teaching practice. So very important document for our administrators to know about, the California Standards for the Teaching Profession. And they're going to pick just 1, maybe 2. We want to keep this very focused. So then they go on and have this conversation, right, that they are video recording, and they are going to focus on some key points here that are listed for the candidate. So A through E. You know, we want to hear the teacher candidate talking to the volunteer teacher and eliciting information about what is the topic of their lesson, what are the learning goals going to be, what prior knowledge do students have to have before they come into this lesson, and what was taught in that prior lesson. Then moving on to what will the classroom setting or learning be. Now we're in a world of COVID, so it very well could be that the learning environment is an online environment, or maybe it is hybrid, so we would need to know that. And then the next point is, who are the students in this class? And what are their assets and what are their needs? We then ask them to discuss what is the ed tech and resources that might be used during this lesson by the volunteer teacher that will extend learning of content by these students. And then finally, what other relevant information do I need to know, for example, before I come into your classroom and observe your teaching? So we give a lot of guidance here to the candidate about what should be covered in this conversation. The next section, section 2, looks particularly at the video recording of the meeting. And again, information for the candidate. So more information about what should be discussed in this meeting and what should be captured on that video recording. So a little bit repetitive here to what is in step 1 there, A through E. So you can see here in step 2, again, what are the instructional components? Which students are English learners, which are standard English learners, which students in this group may be on an IEP 504 or have been identified as gifted, and what additional supports might they need during this lesson? Which CSTP element have you jointly selected and why? You know, because they should be focused on instructional work that is in relation to the students in front of the volunteer teacher. And then what is the protocol for the observation? So how will the volunteer teacher collect information about the one element? This is a really important point here. You might want to highlight this, that whatever tool, protocol, or observation form is used by the volunteer teacher when they're observing this synchronous lesson, where the volunteer teacher is teaching their students synchronously, they need to only be recording information about the one element. This is a really key point and something that really needs to be explained to the candidates. And then finally there, that 5th point, any of that other information that is relevant, that needs to be known and shared prior to an observation being conducted. Things related to other support staff, for example, that might be in the room. Is there a paraprofessional that's going to be online or in the room with the students? And if so, what is their purpose? Will there be any kind of adjustment for moving from one segment to another? Bell schedules, maybe not such a big deal anymore now that we're in online teaching spaces mostly, but anything that's related to the setting for instruction, what needs to be known ahead of that observation. So then that moves us on, and there's some very explicit information here now about the 2 video clips that need to be pulled out from the longer video recording of the lesson by the volunteer teacher. So, of the conversation of the pre-conference with the volunteer teacher. So the first clip, it may not be more than 4 minutes. And we talked about how in a written narrative, the assessors are trained to only read that full amount of pages. So if it says up to 5 pages, assessors only read 5 pages. This is also true for videos. If the video can be up to 4 minutes, no more than 4 minutes, then any video that is submitted that's longer than 4 minutes with annotations, that will not be counted or reviewed by the assessor. So in video clip 1, we're looking for 2 particular things: coaching, including those prompting and clarifying questions that lead to the volunteer teacher's self-assessment of needs and challenges based on the lesson plan they intend to teach. And then secondly, looking at how the candidate is supporting the teacher to identify that one element of the CSTP from one of the 6 domains. So we need to see that in the first clip. How is that happening in the pre-conference meeting? In the second video clip that the candidate then pulls out, we need to see the candidate reviewing the coaching and observation process with the volunteer teacher. So the candidate is explaining to the volunteer teacher what is the coaching cycle, how it's going to unfold, what will happen in the observation, what can the volunteer teacher expect. And the second point, that review then of the identified element and what particular data, when the candidate is in the classroom or in that synchronous setting with the volunteer teacher, what will they be looking to gather? What might they share in the post-observation meeting with the volunteer teacher? We have a pullout there that just speaks to the video clips. All video clips in these assessment cycles have to be unedited. So they cannot add music, they cannot add titles, they cannot add any moving graphics, nothing. It needs to be a pure clip pulled from the video recording without any editing. The other point, just again to the candidate, is that only the 4 minutes will be observed and watched by the assessor. And finally, very, very important, again, you may want to highlight this last point in this call out box. We need to see the candidate in the video clip, and we need to see the volunteer teacher in the video clip. We need to see them both in the video clip. All right, let's keep going. Now we're on page 10. Now we're going to talk explicitly. We have our candidates video record the entire pre-conference. Then they're going to pull out 2 clips. During that process of pulling out and uploading those clips inside of the system for assessment, they then have the tool to annotate their 4-minute video clip or less. And we need them to annotate and show exactly where, through a timestamp, what they are doing. So the first thing we ask them to show us is where they're determining instructional needs and challenges based on the identified CSTP element. Where is that happening in the dialogue between the candidate and that volunteer teacher? And they're going to go in and timestamp where they're doing that, and then give us an annotation where they're asked to tell us what they are doing and why they are doing it. Again, so important, an annotation. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? The next annotation that we need to see is the lesson plan review. So where in these 2 clips are they providing that joint review of the lesson plan, where they're looking at it together with the volunteer teacher, including what will the students be doing during this lesson to produce something to demonstrate their learning? What's that classroom context? What are the assets that these students have? So important, asset-based instruction and assessment. What is it that these students already know and are able to do? What do they bring into this lesson? And then also, what are the additional learning needs that might be part of the instruction that needs to happen for this group of students? The third annotation is around that selection of that co-selection of a CSTP element. One domain, one of the 6 domains, one element under one of those 6 domains. Which one is it going to be, and what is going to be the observation focus? And then finally, coaching and process. So where in this pre-observation conference are we hearing the candidate talk to the volunteer teacher about what is going to happen in the coaching process and in that observation process, and what data will be collected during that observation conference that will then come in to that post-conference. Now we have one more annotation box that just speaks explicitly to annotations. Again, so important. What are you doing? Why are you doing it? And the information provided in the annotation must be directly linked to the timestamp segment of the video recording. What we're doing here in this type of evidence is we're looking to see if the candidate, the administrative services candidate, can look at their own practice in a video recording and identify where they're doing things and why they're doing it. So we need to see the link between the annotation description of the what and the why and the timestamp. And then they do have labels inside the system. They must provide at least each annotation once across the 2 clips, but they can provide as many as they want. So they can put in multiple times where they're doing things, that's fine, but we need at least one. The system is set up that if they have not used each one of the 4 annotations across their 2 clips, it won't allow them to submit their work. So it's a little check and balance that's been built into the system to help support the candidate. So that is that section on page 10. And then on page 11, you just see again that summary of the evidence to be submitted for this step 2, which is that written narrative. What is the classroom context, the lesson that will be taught, and the observation protocol that will be used or tool that will be used? What is the volunteer teacher's lesson plan, including what is the work product the students will be creating? And then finally, part D, those 2 annotated video clips that are each up to 4 minutes apiece. So that's step 2. So back to you, Marco, and we'll go back to our slide deck, and you can give them tips about what you're seeing as a lead assessor and ways to really support those candidates.
So Amy, we've missed the essential question piece. Do you want to cover that before
What we'll do, Lori, is we'll come back to that at the end of the 4 steps.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, so in step 2, some of the items that we're seeing where candidates are scoring more points, specifically speaking to some of our videos, right? We have 2 video clips that can be uploaded, plus up to 4 pages of a narrative text. So there are multiple opportunities for them to cover some of those main points in step 2, which include how they listen to understand what the learning goals are for the lesson, what the classroom context is, as Amy said, what the students' assets and needs are, which CSTP element or elements will be the focus of the lesson, and then what evidence or student work samples might be collected during that lesson. So again, where we're seeing candidates score more points is when they jointly agree on the CSTP that they will be looking at. So again, if we look at our rubric, some of the language here, it says is the candidate directing the conversation? Are they broadly discussing it? Are they engaging in a two-way conversation with the volunteer teacher? And then are they using facilitative questioning strategies? And then redirecting when needed, and looking for those equitable opportunities. So those are really the different levels of the rubric. So if our candidate is directing the entire conversation, they're going to score lower. If they're actually in a coaching mode and using facilitative questioning, then their opportunity to score higher is better. So let's look at some of these tips. So some of the things that we have found is, again, they stay within the 4-page written narrative, which is the maximum. And then one of the things that Amy mentioned that is really critical in this narrative is on one of the portions when they're asked about the classroom demographics. We are looking for them to describe the student assets and needs. And one of the things that we see most often is that the assets tend to be glossed over or forgotten. So again, candidates who score higher really focus on both of those areas, the assets and the needs. And here's one example. Ask your students to be very explicit in their writing. Don't leave it up to the assessor to interpret what they meant to write. And for example, if someone says 60% of my classroom, they're gifted and talented students, right? Students with gifted and talented education. We take that as just classroom demographics. That's neither an asset or a need, right? It could be one or the other or both or none. So that's where candidates who are very explicit and say an asset is 60% of my students are gifted and talented, and then this enables them to, and then they go and describe why that is an asset, they do better. The same thing with the needs. And so there's an opportunity to include that in the written narrative and then also within the videos. Amy also mentioned that in those videos, both candidates have to be visible within that video. And even when we're using Zoom, the camera switches between who is speaking. And so when we see both of them, we know that they were having that conversation. The videos do have to be continuous and unedited. That's what the annotations are for. And so we do have 4 annotations in this area, and they have to place them where they occur. So if one of the annotations says, this is where we've selected our CSTP, they can go and describe that, but it has to be at the timestamp where it's actually happening. We have also seen instances where someone will upload a 6, 7, or 8-minute video clip, and some of those annotations come in after the 4-minute mark. And unfortunately, we cannot score that because it's beyond our time limit. And when that happens, then that usually incurs a condition code. So please ask your candidates to keep to the 4-minute time limit for each of the 2 clips. And then annotations have to be placed where they're actually occurring in that video. 8 minutes of total time is not a lot of time. So another tip is I've seen where the candidate will share the CSTPs with the volunteer teacher in the video. And sometimes it's the first time that the volunteer teacher is seeing them, or the first time in a long time. And then they sit and kind of read them over, and that chews up some of that time on the videos. So I would recommend to candidates to email the CSTPs ahead of time so that the volunteer teacher can read them. And then when they meet, they can jointly select it because there's that familiarity with them at that point. So they can look at those in advance, then that can save them some time on this limited time for these video clips. Okay. And then really looking at the student work, they also talk about what evidence or student work they'd like to have collected during the lesson. Again, candidates should be able to focus on student work that is related to the CSTP that they're going to be monitoring for. We have had examples where the teacher will say, I'd like you to look at how many interruptions happen with calls from the office or from the PA system. And if it's not related to the CSTP element, then they're not going to do as well because it's unrelated evidence. So it should be aligned to that selected CSTP. So sending those CSTPs in advance can help with the video clips. The annotations are very important. And then also, because this is where they're beginning the coaching conversation, candidates who tend to do better are the ones who have some kind of protocol with them that has some of the questions that they may be asking during the coaching conversation, because that helps keep them on track. And then it ensures that they ask those questions that they need to get information for to fill in step 2. So if they have some pre-written questions with them, they tend to do better. Those who do not come in with a protocol tend to forget some of the questions that they need to ask. They sometimes go on tangents, which is important information, but it may not be related to the cycle. And so then they may not ask those follow-up questions and skip over those. And then later as they're writing, they may not have that information to include in their step 2. So that's another way to help maximize that time on those video clips. Okay. All right. Next slide.
All right, well, as I forewarned, I wasn't sure we would have time for a break, and I do not believe we do, because we have lots of important information that we want to share with you beyond the steps. So we are going to invite you to take a break as you need it, and we're going to continue along, and we're going to move now into step 3 and move a little more quickly through the guide. And again, please, we invite you to put your questions in the chat. So Gay, with that, I will turn it back to you.
Making sure I am unmuted first. So looking into our assessment guide, we are currently at the top of page 12 with ACT. ACT has 4 Roman numerals underneath it, or 4 steps. It's a very dense step within the cycle, and it actually covers the observation itself as well as the post-observation meeting between them. So during the classroom observation, it notes in that first paragraph that the observation should be at least 20 minutes in length. And then jumping to that next paragraph in bold, you'll see it says video record the teacher's instruction for the full duration of that observation. The candidate is going to be analyzing this video recording. They're going to use it during the post-observation meeting, and it's going to guide the discussion, especially targeting the CSTP that they have used as evidence. Jumping back up to that first paragraph, the observation is 1 or 2 CSTP elements, but the phrase I want you to look at is in that same line, meeting during with the volunteer teacher. So again, not directed to them, but engaging them, including them, talking about the student work. Finally, they are asked to submit the notes that they took during the observation. It could be on a form, or it could just be free-handed notes. But as Amy said earlier, it is on the 1 or 2 CSTP elements, not all of their notes, but on the targeted CSTP that was being used. Also with student work product, targeted to the CSTP. Moving into Roman numeral 2, this is preparation for the post-observation meeting. The candidate needs to analyze the volunteer teacher's performance on the video recording, looking particularly for the 1 or 2 CSTP elements that they have been asked to gather information around, looking at student work products and analyzing them for the exact same thing, and then identifying those teachers' strengths and possible areas for growth as it relates to those CSTP. In the second paragraph there, prepare for the post-observation meeting by developing guiding questions. Marco said earlier about how those who were prepared and had some kind of a format, knew where they were going, spent the time with their volunteer teacher very much more targeted, got through the work in the time frame. Again, the questions are based on the CSTP, and the candidate is to engage the volunteer teacher in a conversation using these guiding questions. Very important that it becomes a conversation between the 2 of them. During this post-observation meeting, they can suggest ways of improving instructional practice related to the elements. They should also discuss the instruction around those CSTP elements. Another important note, they should watch the video of the lesson together during the post-observation meeting, and we'll have some tips later on for you to talk about how to film this for the video clips that are required, that you don't see the students, but you know it's a synchronous lesson that they are watching together, the candidate and the volunteer teacher. And then finally, the last sentence here, in addition, the candidate will ask the volunteer teacher for feedback. Again, going back with what Marco said, they need to make sure that information is there when they go to write the narrative. So to cover the gathering of feedback is very important. Moving on to Roman numeral 3, this is the post-observation meeting. Again, a video recording, and in that first sentence, you might highlight the entire post-observation meeting. They're including when they watch the observation video. At this point, they don't know what clips they're going to be using. So having it all videotaped will make sure that they have all of the choices there. The goal for the post-observation meeting is to foster learning conversations so that instructional practice is improved and student learning is enhanced based on the focused CSTP elements. And the meeting should demonstrate mutual respect for, rapport with, and responsive to that teacher while they are engaging in a professional learning session. During the post-observation conference, they should also review student work, coach the volunteer teacher to self-identify their strengths and areas for growth, share the observation evidence, the student work to support the questions that the candidate has developed, and really provide an opportunity for that volunteer teacher to provide feedback at the end about the candidate's coaching strengths and areas for growth. Remember, this is a leadership cycle. Moving into that next paragraph in the middle of page 13, using a collaborative approach, they are going to have a two-way conversation with the teacher. They're going to discuss the following bullets: the teacher's self-assessment of their instruction, specific information from the candidate's notes, the effectiveness of the teacher's practices, so the analysis that has been done, jointly determining next steps, and then finally getting feedback from the volunteer teacher. Finally, Roman numeral 4 is where the candidate goes back and works with the video of the meeting and selects video clips. They may choose 1 to 5 video clips. The total for all video clips is 10 minutes, and a single clip must be at least 1 minute in length to provide the context that we understand. The call out here is the same that Amy looked at before with the addition of that first bullet. We're just saying that it is 5 video clips maximum. Fewer may be chosen. The annotations, Amy went over, but they are about the what and the why. But these video clips, there are 5 annotation titles: the teacher's self-assessment and the analysis of their practice. Secondly, the evidence sharing and analysis. Thirdly, the effectiveness of teaching practices. Fourthly, agreed upon next steps for the volunteer teacher. And then that also important number 5, which goes on to the top of page 15, the coaching feedback. The annotations and labels call out box is the same as Amy went over previously. And then finally on page 15, the evidence to be submitted. There are 3 pieces of evidence that the assessors will look at and the candidate will submit. E are the notes or the forms that they use for the evidence on the CSTP elements during the observation. Part F, student work products from this lesson. Part G, 1 to 5 video clips, and the reminder is there again. Total of 10 minutes long, no more than that, or the assessor will not be watching that video. And a single clip must be at least 1 minute in length. So back to the slide deck and Mario's tips.
Thanks, Kay. So yes, so for step 3, this is a pretty big part of the cycle. So if we look at step 3, there are 3 rubrics that are used in this step. So that's a total of 15 points. So this is really important in this cycle. So here we're looking at the focused classroom observation, the preparation for the post-observation meeting, how they conduct the actual post-observation meeting, and then the evidence that they submit for their coaching. So let's move on to our next slide. And so here we're looking for the candidate to be able to recognize and document the qualities of the CSTP. We're looking to see if there's a learning conversation happening during this post-observation meeting that they're having and videotaping. And looking at the volunteer teacher, who's determining the next steps? Are they co-determined, or is the candidate directing that conversation? So we're really looking for this coaching conversation where they're both co-determining next steps, and then our candidate can provide appropriate resources and coaching support as needed. So let's take a look at some of the tips. So for rubric 3.3, this is where they document their observation notes. This is where they're looking and actually videotaping that lesson that's happening. And there is no standard form for documenting classroom practice. So we've seen a wide variety of forms that are used from around the state. Some of them are even just blank forms that they've word processed on. Some create a T-chart and they list what the teacher does, what the students are doing, and that's all fine. The important thing is that our candidates document successful CSTP teaching practices, that they are looking at the CSTP or CSTP elements that were agreed upon in step 1 and 2. So we've also seen where some of our candidates will post a document that's used in their district, and it lists all of the CSTPs with all of the CSTP elements. And they start to mark off everything that they're seeing connected to a CSTP. So again, that may distract from the focus CSTP. So a tip is for candidates to just focus on the 1 or 2 CSTP elements that were pre-identified. That way they stayed centered on what they're looking for. Okay. So we also look to see if they document a missed teaching opportunity. So candidates who score higher will make annotations on their observation form, such as, oh, this was a missed teaching opportunity where the teacher could have used an engagement strategy to really enhance the learning. Or they document where the teacher pivoted based on the responses from students and realized that they had to shift what they were doing to make sure that students were understanding the topic of the lesson. So again, they score more points as they make these notes that they're going to use in their post-observation conference during that coaching conversation. Okay. So as we move into rubrics 3.4 and 3.5, this is the post-observation conference. And again, they're allowed to upload up to 5 video clips. The minimum for each one is 1 minute, and they cannot exceed 10 minutes in length. So it is possible for someone to upload 1 clip of 10 minutes or 5 clips of 2 minutes each. Again, assessors stop scoring once we reach that 10-minute mark. And just like in step 2, there are annotations that have to be used at appropriate places within the lesson. Both candidate and volunteer teacher must appear in the videos, and they must watch the lesson together. And I know there was a question in the chat about asking for clarity. If the candidates in the video, if our candidate says, I sent you the video, we watched it previously, and they're addressing that they did review those videos, we will accept that and we will score it as them watching that video together. Some of them will actually view the video together while they're recording this. So they share their screen, they share the recording on Zoom, and they watch portions of the video together. Again, 10 minutes is not a whole lot of time. So another tip is if our candidates clip the videos, they share the video in advance, and then they just watch those strategic pieces of the videos together, then it saves some time for that coaching conversation during step 3 and 4, okay? But they do have to appear in both. We have had instances where our candidates only appear in the video and the volunteer teachers do not. Even if they appeared in step 2 previously on the videos, they still have to appear on the videos in step 3, otherwise we do condition code them. Here, one of the differences is in step 2, they were asked to look at students' strengths and areas of need. Here, the candidate is now looking at what went well with the teaching lesson, right? And what needed some improvement. So now it's the teacher's strength and areas for growth. So that's what our candidate is now looking for. What was the teacher doing? And then they connect it back to the CSTP elements. And they should look at that student evidence or student work. So whatever student work they agreed to collect, they should be analyzing it together during this portion as well. So candidates who do that with their volunteer teachers tend to score higher in the rubric, where they're taking a look at the student work, and the student work is aligned to the CSTP elements that were selected, not just random student work that was turned in. Okay. And then they should co-identify those next steps, like what they might do differently, and then also identify some resources to provide that teacher to help them with their teaching practice. So those are all really important pieces that we're looking for during this part of step 3 and 4. Okay, and
Great. So let's move on to step 4. So Lori, will have you take us back into the guide, and we'll look at page 16, step 4, reflect. Remember, each of our 3 leadership cycles have this step of reflecting at the end of the cycle. And candidates always have a choice on step 4 to either write their response to us in a written narrative or to video record themselves responding to the prompts. Very interesting and insightful to listen to a candidate talk about their own practice. So we're encouraging candidates to consider a video recording of their response to these prompts. There are 3 prompts, and the third prompt is broken into 2 parts. So let's start with the beginning. So what do they need to be telling us in their reflection? So again, based on the work that they have gone through in steps 1, 2, and 3 for this leadership cycle, and as they think about the feedback that they elicited from the volunteer teacher about the process of being coached and observed, what, candidate, are your strengths and areas for growth? So we're asking the candidate to think back through steps 1, 2, and 3 and evaluate their strengths and areas for growth in coaching and observation. And then in particular, the feedback that they gathered from the volunteer teacher in relation to that one CSTP element that they are focused on. And then also to explain why the candidate thinks they should work on these skills. The second prompt asks them to reflect on insight evidence from, it can be implicit or explicit, but it must be directly related to the work of steps 1, 2, or 3 and not be off topic. They need to reflect on and cite evidence about their facilitation and the maintaining of a two-way conversation. So how are they collaborating? How are they working together in a co-facilitated way with this volunteer teacher? And how are they able to encourage the teacher voice and ownership around those strengths and areas for growth? How are they doing that with this volunteer teacher in that coaching mode? And then finally, the third narrative looks at continuous improvement. This is a mindset that we want our equitable leaders in California to have. So we're focusing here in this third question on that continuous improvement mindset and equitable leadership, and asking them to pause and reflect on how that coaching observation or instructional feedback at that school site in which they're working, in that culture, how these strategies support teacher development and benefit students. So the point of coaching, right, what we're trying to get here from the candidate is that they're connecting the dots and they're understanding that coaching can lead to improved conditions for student learning because coaching will help improve teacher practice. So that's what we're asking them. In what ways could coaching at this school site be improved, right? So in the second part B, if the coaching observation or instructional feedback at that school site are not part of the current school practice, because we know in some of our schools it's not going on yet. Teachers aren't getting coaching. If it's not part of the school site's practice, then how might implementing these strategies develop and support teacher development and benefit students, right? So it's, if they are going on, what are you seeing that is beneficial to teachers and to students? If it's not going on, what could be beneficial to teachers and or students? And what might then be challenging if it's not going on? If they're faced with having to implement this for the first time at a school site, what are the challenges they might face? And that wraps up cycle 3. So what we're going to do next is go back to Marco for some tips on this last section, and then we'll go on and take a quick look at our 7 essential questions that help us understand what's being measured in this cycle. So Marco, back to you.
Thank you, Amy. So yes, so this is the reflection stage. And at the end of stage 3, there is a part where our candidates are asked to elicit feedback from their volunteer teachers on our candidates' coaching practice. They're going to use that information here to reflect on step 4. So in this instance, we will often see that our candidates think about their own coaching practice, and step 4 is divided into like 2 rubrics. So this is worth 10 points. So it's also kind of a biggie. So there are 2 5-point rubrics. One is on reflecting on their coaching practice, and then the other is really thinking about that continuous improvement mindset, and then their role as an equity-driven school leader and how to change the feedback and coaching culture at the school site if it's not happening or not happening to a high level of quality. So let's go on to our next slide. And so here, again, there's a 4-page limit on this section. So stay within that 4-page limit. This one is a little different, where our candidates can also submit a video clip with a limit of 5 minutes. So they can actually do an oral reflection and record that and then upload that. So they have the option of doing one or the other. So what we often see is that our candidates will think about their coaching and say, here are my strengths, here are my areas for growth, this went well, this didn't. But in order to score higher on our rubrics, they have to take evidence on the feedback that the volunteer teacher shared. So that's why it's so important for them to elicit that feedback during step 3, because then as they're writing or reflecting, they will say, my volunteer teacher said that they really appreciated X, Y, and Z, and then our candidates reflect on that feedback. Also, like, these are the areas where my volunteer teacher said that I could improve upon in terms of coaching, and then they do that. What we often see also is that many volunteer teachers are reluctant to be very critical and provide that area for growth. So successful candidates will elicit some of that and say, this is for my professional learning, I'm not taking it personal, please provide areas for growth, right? I need this to complete the assignment. So they really probe to get that information so that they have a good amount of feedback to reflect on. Okay. Then they're making connections to the continuous improvement cycle on the final rubric. So what does this mean for their school site? When we opened, Gay talked about current practices in step 1. Now we're moving on how you improve those for future practice at the school site. So thinking about this cycle, you as an equity-driven leader, what improvements would you do at your school site as a school leader? And so then we're looking at how they use evidence from the cycle. So again, they cross that bridge back to the other steps. And then they bring in evidence from this cycle and use that as part of their evidence to reflect and talk about how they would improve coaching and feedback for teacher practice at their school site. So another tip, and this sometimes might be difficult, but when our candidates are seeking volunteer teachers, we do advise them to select teachers that they know will not be camera shy and are going to volunteer lots of good information, a good conversation that will be recorded. Because if you have a volunteer teacher who's very quiet and very short answers, it's very hard to conduct the full coaching conversation in that way. And then our candidates struggle a little more in that area. So picking the right volunteer teacher is also critical. Okay. All right, next slide, please. All right, so for the reflective writing here, just thinking about our experiences, this kind of inverted pyramid, we're thinking about the experience that we have, and that reflection is so important because we tend to learn more from reflecting on the experiences that we have. rather than just experiencing things on their own. And so that's really where we're looking for our candidates to write to in this last area. We are looking for equity. So earlier we also heard that we're looking out for all of our students. And so here specifically, we want to know, yes, how this benefits all of our students, but then even traditionally underrepresented minority students in our school sites. And so how do we bring that conversation forward? And then we want them to reflect and talk about that in 3.7, an equity-driven leader. So if we go to our next slide, this comes from San Diego State University, and they have equity-driven leadership. So looking at schools as these complex organizations, so we want them to look at how they might improve education in these areas, right? So that has to come through on 3.7 to reach those higher points on the rubric scale. So, all right, thank you.
Thank you again, Marco. Very helpful, all your expertise that you're sharing. So what we want to do now is just make sure that if any of you are new and joining us in this work, that you understand how our rubrics are formatted. They are analytic rubrics. And as we spoke a little bit to this earlier, each rubric has very specific evidence that is used to make the score judgment. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. This is what our rubrics look like. If you haven't had a chance yet to look at them, they're all provided at the end of each assessment guide for our candidates. We expect programs to review these rubrics with candidates, use them in coursework, and have candidates use them in peer review processes, and certainly candidates should be using them to self-assess their own work before they submit. But the format is what is important here. So we want to start by pointing out that the title up here is always going to be provided. So this is a step 1 rubric for investigate, our very first step of the 4 steps. And it is in fact 3.1. So you'll note that as well. The essential question is always provided at the top of the rubric, and the essential question focuses both the candidate, the program support folks, and our assessors on what is being measured. So in this case, this rubric is looking at how the candidate describes and analyzes the current role of teacher coaching, observation, and or instructional feedback practices at the school site in which they're doing their work, and explains the implications for their approach to conducting a coaching cycle. So how is that current practice at that one school site going to perhaps impact their approach to conducting a coaching cycle? So we then have our assessors always start at level 3. Level 3 description is in response directly to what is asked for in the essential question. And each level of our rubric has multiple constructs, multiple concepts, knowledge, skill, and ability that we need to see the candidate provide evidence for. And it is a direct match between the language in the rubric and the evidence submitted. So in this case, you can see that we need to find evidence of where the candidate describes and analyzes the current role of coaching, observation, instructional feedback, including the purpose and intended goals of these practices at the school site. The second set of text here gets into more of evidence that we need to see. The candidate needs to describe plans for and implications of each step of the coaching cycle and observation based on the volunteer teacher's professional experience, current assignment for teaching, and past experience in relation to coaching. So if they're working with a veteran teacher who is comfortable on camera, et cetera, as Marco was pointing out, they're going to have a teacher that they can really implement a full coaching cycle with, and they can be clear in that process, and they can know the volunteer teacher they're working with is familiar with the process. On the other hand, they may be working with a volunteer teacher who's never been coached, so they would need to take a different approach, and we would want to hear about that. If we have all of this evidence, then for this rubric, the candidate would be given that level 3 score. I want to point out that what happens when we go up to level 4, at the top you can see the text is a little different. It says all of level 3, so that means all the text of level 3, we have evidence for that. And then in addition, we have all the evidence that's listed in level 4. In order to get to a level 5, which is a rare occurrence, we need to see all the evidence presented by the candidate for level 3, all the evidence for level 4 and all of the evidence asked for in level 5. So you can see that level 5 is the most comprehensive response, and we're seeing really quite clear, highly detailed, relevant information and evidence presented as asked for. Level 2 is given when we do not have all the evidence for level 3. We now must drop down and consider, is this a level 2 response? Do I have evidence of level 2? If anything is missing, now I need to consider, is this a level 1 response? Because in fact, the candidate does not provide evidence of an explanation of the purpose or process for coaching at that school site, etc. So that's how the 5 levels work. Remember, again, essential question lays out what's being measured. Level 3 is related directly to what is in the essential question. It builds up to 4 and 5 and builds down to level 2 and 1. Another really important part of our rubric format is that you can see which CAPE are measured, very helpful to programs. And then finally at the bottom, so important, you may want to highlight this. This is where we very clearly state what will be used to make the score judgment. In this case, it is only one piece of evidence. It is part A, the written narrative. So assessors look at this written narrative, they come back and based on the evidence provided, make that score judgment. And that's how each one of our rubrics work. In this cycle, we have 7 rubrics. So Lori, can you take us to the page in the guide, and we'll just take a quick look at our 7 essential questions and what is being measured in each step here in this cycle.
For step 1, Amy just covered my one and only rubric for under investigate. So I'm going to real quick turn it back to Amy to do plan, step 2.
Okay, or you can do step 2, Gay. Why don't you do step 2?
But I have all mine highlighted in step 3.
Oh, okay, forget it. Wait, we'll back up. Don't want to throw you off. All right, in rubric 3.2. So first of all, I just want to pause and just say, please see how these rubrics are spread out across this cycle. So we have 1 rubric for investigate, and we just covered that. We have 1 rubric for planning, but we have 3 rubrics in act, because it's so important that we see the actions taken by the candidate. And then we have 2 rubrics in reflect, when they reflect on the process. So in 3.2, we're looking at how the candidate listens to and talks with that volunteer teacher to understand the learning goals, context, student assets, and learning needs, and how this is so important here. Please highlight the word jointly, how they jointly select that 1 or 2 CSTP elements from one domain, including evidence to be collected and the plan for the observation. So important things there and aspects of that question that we're measuring there. So Gay, back to you for step 3.
Step 3, as Amy said, really focuses in on the candidate's leadership abilities, not the actual observation, but to how they approach it, conduct it, and reflect upon it. So rubric 3.3 says, how does the candidate recognize and document those qualities of teaching practice that focus around the 1 or 2 CSTP elements and the learning goals? Pre-planning for that post-observation conference. 3.4 talks about the conference itself. Does the candidate foster a learning conversation? As Jamie said, jointly is important. It's a back and forth conversation. It goes over the CSTP observation evidence, the video, which is evidence, student work, which is evidence, and then discusses strengths and areas of growth for that teacher. And then finally, rubric 3.5 is reflecting back on that post-observation conversation. So with the volunteer teacher, in partnership is what the words are here, how do they co-determine next steps? Could be around professional development or resources or coaching support. So during this post-observation meeting with the teacher, how did the candidate show leadership skills in developing their next steps?
Great, thanks, Gay. So those are the 3 rubrics in step 2, and then we have 2 remaining in step 4. And again, just quickly, what we're measuring here is how the candidate analyzes their capacity to conduct that CSTP-focused coaching and observation process. based on their experience and feedback. Again, highlight this feedback from the volunteer teacher and how they cite evidence to demonstrate their ability to facilitate and maintain that coaching partnership. When we say cite evidence, again, they need to be referring their reflective writing back to what happened in step 1, 2, and or 3. They cannot be off topic here and telling us about other information. It needs to be related to the work accomplished in this instructional cycle. And so they need to cite that evidence. And then 3.7 takes a look at how the candidate, again, we're going back to this concept of continuous improvement mindset, this notion of working together, we are all getting better. And how do we do that as we move forward in our work as educators? So we're looking for that improvement mindset and focus on equitable leadership. And we're looking to see how the candidate has understood the potential impact of coaching and reflects on benefits. Now, this is important too, to both teachers. How is coaching beneficial to teachers? How is coaching then beneficial to students at that school site? So both are very important. So those are our 7 rubrics for step 2, and we're going to move along here because we have more important information that we really want to share with you. We invite you to take time to look through the 5 levels for each of these 7 rubrics and really use them in your programs and in your conversations with your teacher, your leader candidates. All right, and again, we do see your questions. We'll get back to them and or stay on with us, and we'll make sure that we do answer them after the webinar wraps up at 3 o'clock. All right, so let's keep going. And we're going to move through these tips. We have already shared a lot of tips with you, so we're going to kind of move through them quickly.
So consult. We have a document on the faculty website. We're not going to take you there, but know that that is a link, and Lori can put the address in the chat for us, but of acceptable supports. We have candidates who are now in induction experiences, and our program directors in our induction program want to know, how can I best support them? This place is a good start. Things that you can do when working with candidates to ensure that you're adhering to their submission guidelines. And then secondly, provide time for them to share their draft submissions, either with like other candidates for peer review, a self-reflection piece. Both of those things are very helpful for candidates to not finish it at 11:58 so they can submit it at 11:59 before the deadline. And then finally, schedule coaching sessions with candidates. Allow the coach to ask reflective questions as per the acceptable supports, and allow the candidate to reflect upon the strength of their submissions. Again, our coaches aren't telling them what to submit, but asking questions to have the candidate think again, is this as strong as I could make it? And next slide. Continuing on, use locally designed reflection guides. They are out there. Many of our programs have designed them. If you have, or designed one of your own. Ensure each requirement has been addressed, and to check the strength of the narrative. These guides are helpful for both of those things. And secondly, provide opportunities to pull up the rubric and have the candidate go construct by construct. Do I have this in there? Can someone else see where I have addressed this piece, to ensure that they have a robust submission? And then finally, allow the candidates time. Oh, sorry, this is for remediating. So if they get it back and they did not have a passing score, allow the candidate time to express their emotions. It is very upsetting to not pass a cycle after putting so much work and effort into this. Then together, sit down and deconstruct with them. Talk about what the submission looks like against a rubric construct. Encourage a peer review, to have them take that submission to another candidate to help them identify places that are not strong, places that are missing, just anywhere that they can edit. And then again, provide locally designed reflection guides to identify any of those pieces that they might add in to make it an acceptable submission.
Great, thanks, Gay. Let's go to the next slide, please. So again, some general tips here for working online. And I'm going to point out to you that all of these tips are provided on our website. Lori, if you'll put that website in the chat so people can go and take a look there. But we do need to point out that we do have guidelines and guidance for working in online settings. It must be synchronous. That means at the same time, just like we're with you right now, we are working together at the same time. That is synchronous. And so that is the only kind of work that we can accept in these assessments. And we'll talk a little bit at the end about flexibilities here for candidates who cannot work in online settings. We understand it is up to the district. And if a candidate cannot work in an online setting and they have no other option, they will have to delay completing their APA, but we will come back to that topic. All right, our next point is that assessment requirements must be met as written in the current assessment guides. And that's why it's so important to be very careful to read the assessment guides and pay attention to what is asked for. So whether they're working in person as a leader on a school site at the school site building, or whether they're working in line as a leader online, that's fine. It's just that they still must meet all the requirements set forth. Of course, districts are the ones that decide whether there can be any online recording of practice. So be very careful. And when it is allowed, make sure you have permissions in place. You can use an external camera. I'll demonstrate. You can hold your phone up like this and video record yourself and your screen. That is an option and very acceptable. Let's go to the next slide, please. In this slide, we're going to take a quick look at some more general tips for online settings. This is very important. We do need to see the leader candidate and the students in the video clip. So in this case, it's the leader, it is the preliminary leader and their volunteer teacher that we need to see in the video clips. And then uploaded video clips always, always, always must be unedited. And finally, they must adhere to those district guidelines. Next slide, please. So in particular, in cycle 3, the candidate must understand what the current practices were and perhaps are still at the school site in which they are doing their CalAPA work and their clinical practice, their placement field work. So even though it may look a little different right now because of all that's going on, they do need to understand what was happening and perhaps is still happening at that school. Very important. Again, remember, if things are really in a situation where it's been moved to asynchronous learning or whatever that current culture and setting is at that school, it may be that the candidate needs to postpone completion. All right, second point, the candidate may conduct pre and post meetings with their teacher here in this synchronous online setting. So important, it needs to be in real time. And then finally, we have to see them. Next slide, please. So this is an important point. There is a video recording that we ask the leader candidate to do with their volunteer teacher, and it must be of synchronous instruction. So the volunteer teacher can be teaching online synchronously, or they can be teaching in person synchronously with students. Either one is just fine. We do need, if it is an online setting, we do need to make sure that it's clear enough so that when the leader candidate and the volunteer teacher are in their post-conference, whether this is happening prior to the post-conference or during the post-conference, that video capture of the lesson must be clear and must be audible so that they can really use that video recording to direct their conversation about instructional practice. Next slide, please. So in this, we're pointing out that the observation video must be referenced in the conversation during the post-observation meeting. And Marco covered this really clearly, and we had a few questions, so hopefully you're understanding. We either need to see them in the post-conference video looking at the lesson video together, or we need to hear them talking about it. So we need to have evidence either through the discussion or actually seeing them do it, but we do need to know that that volunteer teacher observed the recording of the lesson, and then the leader candidate and the volunteer teacher discussed it as part of their discussion about what happened. So very important there. And then finally, candidates must continue to collect and submit at least one example of student work. So even in online settings, students should be involved with producing something. And that work sample must come into the discussion and be part of what is reviewed and also what is submitted. Next slide. Again, just want to send you right here to our ctcexams.nesinc.com website. So many resources here for you. And in particular, we have more tips for online learning for candidates and guidance around how to record online. Again, we'll stay after the hour and answer more questions about this, but we do want to move along so that you are aware of how to access all of these great materials. So next slide. And I believe I'm turning it over to Lori Thornley.
Thanks, Amy. Yes, so we covered this at the beginning, so I won't dwell on it too long, but the faculty resource webpage is your go-to place for all kinds of resources, including all of the assessment materials, the 3 cycle guides, all of the template materials. Those are contained within a downloadable zip file on the website. We did put the password in the chat window at the beginning of the webinar. Or if you miss that, your program coordinator at your site should be able to access those materials for you or provide you with the password. Also, candidates, note that they do have direct access to the materials through the CalAPA submission system once they've registered for a cycle. And so they can get access to the cycle guides and the templates directly as well. Or you can provide them to them through your program, either way. Want to point out that we have a brand new program guide this year. This was published at the beginning of the academic year back in July. This guide is also available on the faculty resource webpage right below the assessment guide zip file. There's a link you can download. And this guide has all kinds of helpful information for faculty and staff and basically anyone who supports candidates in taking the CalAPA. A wealth of information about implementing the CalAPA and resources and supports there. Program coordinators, I encourage you, if you haven't done so, download this file and share it. Share it with your deans, your course instructors, your university site supervisors, school administrators, and just everyone and anyone who supports candidates. Also, for those who may not be aware, we have added at the bottom of the faculty resource webpage links to a set of sample submissions, one from each cycle. Currently, these are from year 2, but they're still very applicable to today's CalTPA. They are, again, the link to access these is at the bottom of the faculty resource webpage. These do require a username and password. Once you get to the site, it takes you off to the Commission's Secure Materials website. And so I have just put those login credentials in the chat window. These sample submissions from 3 different candidates represent mid-range submissions, and included are all of the candidates' written responses, and in the case of cycle 2 and cycle 3, their video evidence as well. They also include not a preview, but a README file at the beginning of each of these samples with some guidance from the Commission on how to read these materials and how you might use those materials in supporting your candidates. And Amy, moving on to program supports, I think this is still me. Here is a glance at the submission and reporting schedule for the 2021 academic year. This information is also on the CalAPA website, I believe on the home landing page of the website. As you can see, there is a submission deadline at least one deadline in just about every month between now and June. And candidates who submit their cycles by the specified date can expect to receive their results 3 weeks later on the corresponding date that you see here. So We had a submission deadline yesterday, September 17th, and any candidates who met that submission deadline can expect to receive their results on October 8th. And as a reminder for those programs who may still have non-consequential candidates, these are candidates from the first operational year of the CalAPA. If you still have non-consequential candidates who are needing to finish up, as a reminder, they must complete all 3 of their cycles by December 31st of this year. Non-consequential candidates who fail to complete all of their cycles will automatically become consequential candidates effective January 1st. That any cycles that they had previously submitted will remain, but for any cycles that they have yet to complete, they will now need to meet the passing standard, and they would need to register and pay for those cycles. So very important to help encourage those candidates to get their 3 cycles completed by the deadline.
We wanted to direct your attention to some upcoming events that are happening also in support of those who are involved in the CalAPA cycles. This is our 3rd year, so hence the 3.1, where we're offering virtual think tanks, where we take a topic and discuss it for about 40 minutes and then open the mic for discussion for those who are participating to share their thoughts as well. We start September the 25th from 1 to 2 p.m. Our topic will be building successful submissions in an online environment. Our co-facilitators are Kitty Fortner from Dominguez Hills and Melissa Metz-Hall from both Riverside County and San Bernardino County Offices of Education, who have spent their summer teaching online and have some really great tips to share on what has made a successful environment for online submissions. Secondly, we have the last of our faculty workshops postponed from the spring. It was to be held in Southern California in the Inland Empire, but now it is open for all. It's October the 13th. We just changed the hours to 8 a.m. to 3 p.m. and it is limited to 100 participants, and you may join alone or you may join as a group from your institution. And finally, our results analyzer is for those who receive data back from evaluation systems that tell you how well your institution did. And now that you have all that data, what do you do with it? Well, you come on October the 19th from 1:30 to 3:30 and meet with evaluation systems folks to learn how to best read the data, use the data, analyze the data, and improve your results at your institution.
Thank you, Gay. And just a few more ongoing supports we want you to be aware of. We have opened office hours directly for candidates to talk to us on Wednesdays from 5 to 5:30, 5:45. We'll stay with them until we've answered all their questions. We had a really wonderful, robust group of candidates with us this Wednesday. We had 45 candidates join us this Wednesday. We had a great discussion about the purpose and expectations of, in particular, Cycle 3. And then we have office hours Thursday mornings from 8 until 8:30 or so for CASC program staff that are trying to learn about this set of leadership cycles. We're there for you during that time period. And then, of course, our standing Thursdays with preliminary programs from 11 to 3:30. We've been holding these weekly office hours for years. We really welcome you to come be with us, and we want you to get your questions answered in an efficient way. So we are available to you every single week, pretty much all year. Then we also offer these virtual think tanks, typically on the last Friday of the month. These are particularly for faculty to talk to each other, faculty and instructors to talk to each other about how to best support candidates as they engage in the 3 cycles and the really important underlying theory of action components that we need our equitable leaders to be paying attention to. And then finally, we realized during COVID that our coordinators at our programs might need a little more support. So instead of meeting once a year, we're now meeting 4 times a year. We just had a meeting a few weeks ago, and we're about to have our next meeting in January. It will be here before we know it, and then again in April. All right, so next slide, please. We will try and be very much wrapped up here at the top of the hour. I think this brings us to almost our last slide. This is how you can reach it. The YouTube channel, which just has a growing number of supports from you, from online webinars about how to work in virtual online settings that we've conducted all throughout the spring, as well as any webinar that we do, we always try to record it and post it, etc. So lots of good information for you here. And then here is the direct playlist of those video supports. You can get to them directly by going to this bit.ly link. And so helpful. And we've had a few questions in the chat about who can have access to what. I just want to make sure that you all understand it is a very transparent system we're trying to offer here. So everything is okay to share with candidates and with faculty and with others. There are no secrets in this work. It is transparent. We want you to support candidates, read their responses, watch their videos, engage with them in professional dialogue, and help build that practice. So please know that everything we provide to you, you are welcome to use as it fits and meets your particular context. Next slide, please. All right, thank you so much for being with us. Technical questions should be going to Pearson at this website. Policy questions can come to us at calapa@ctc.ca.gov. And finally, here is our ctcexams.nessing.com. This is where all the policy supports and materials. This is how you get to those examples of candidate responses. So thank you so much for spending time with us this Friday. Particularly, we want to thank Marco Nava for sharing his expertise. Very kind of him to give 2 hours. Thank you to Lori Thornley, who helped us guide us through looking at all our different documents together. And of course, thank you to Gay Roby, my colleague. And we appreciate all of you and all the hard work you're doing during these challenging times. We are available, do reach out. So with that, we'll go ahead and see if there are other questions that we can answer, and we'll stay with you a bit beyond the top of the hour, the commission staff and Marco if you want. Otherwise, Marco, you are free to move on. I'm sure you have other things to do today, and we will stay and make sure that you are all feeling comfortable with getting your questions answered.
All right, and Amy, it looks like Omar has his hand up.
Great. Omar, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
All right. Yeah, thank you so much. I appreciate this. This has been really helpful. I wish my students were here. It looks like Gay is answering my question by asking me to email her. I just wanted those video links that were on the slide before this one. I can't click on the presentation that's shared. So if it could be put in the chat box, that'd be great.
Sure, I can do that. Thank
you so much. And then in terms of the recording, I think you may have answered this question, but where will the recording of this be so that I could watch it over and over again?
Let's go back one slide, please.
I think the recording is going to be on this slide right here, right? On the
Yes. So it will be on the commission's YouTube channel.
Perfect.
Omar, and we'll you can either go to YouTube and find it, but the APA, the second bullet here, that https bit.ly CalAPA YT for YouTube. This will get you there directly. It will take us a few days to get this recording up, but we have already done a deep dive on cycle 1 and cycle 2. This is cycle 3. So all 3 recordings will be available to all of you probably by midweek next week. And we do invite you to use them with your candidates and anyone else that you think would benefit.
And please excuse me for the follow-up. Am I correct that the bit.ly is taking me to the YouTube, because the YouTube link in there doesn't work, but the bit.ly takes me to a YouTube channel?
Did I type it wrong? Maybe I typed it wrong.
Well, that's okay. If they're
they're the same. The bit.ly should take you
well
direct.
the YouTube channel takes you to the overall channel, and the bit.ly takes you to specifically to the CalAPA playlist, but you can get to the YouTube channel from there.
Got it. Okay. Well, all right.
Yep.
I'll figure it out.
And if you can't, if it's not working for you, Omar, just shoot us an email and we'll, help you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thanks again.
No problem.
The one that Lori typed has a hashtag instead of a period between YouTube and com.
Oh, that's the problem.
Easy to fix.
All right, should we take a quick stroll? Are there other questions?
I see hands raised.
Okay, Lori.
Dana has her hand raised.
Dana, how can we help?
Hi.
Hi.
Quick question. Can you talk just a little tiny bit more? There we go. A little tiny bit more about on the post-conference, if we are not actually showing the video and we're just having a conference, how to represent that we've talked about it previously. So I know I'm the candidate. I will have sent the video to the participating volunteer teacher, but how will we articulate that so it's clear on the post-conference?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think any dialogue around between, right? If I'm the teacher leader, if I'm the leader candidate and I'm talking to my volunteer teacher, I want to be saying things like, when we watched the video together, within the first 5 minutes of instruction, we saw the students being really rambunctious and not settling down. So let's talk a little bit about what we saw in the video when we watched it together, and some strategies for how you might establish a routine so that when your students come into the classroom or into Zoom, they settle down and get ready to work.
Okay, and then when I go to the detail, I also noticed that at minute 10, when the students were transitioning to an activity, blah, blah, blah. Could you talk to me a little bit about that?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then also the comments that we're discussing still, whatever I see needs to be focused on the CSTP that we co-selected.
Right. So here's the whole thing that's so important in cycle 3. One element.
Okay.
Yes, we say you can pick 2, but let's face it. Let's pick 1, right?
Okay.
Let's keep this straightforward. Let's pick 1 element. Then that is the only thing really that observation data should be collected about.
Okay.
So the observation is focused through the lens of the 1 element. And then the data collected and everything else that comes up in that post-conference should all be related to that 1 element.
Okay. And how many students are actually doing it where they're talking about the video that we've already both looked at separately, as opposed to showing the video on the Zoom screen at the same time?
Is Marco still with us?
That's a good question. I think we see them actually most of the time, at least prior to COVID, we were seeing them both looking at the video together during the post, right?
Right, on the
and now we've moved into this new environment, and I think it's about 50-50.
Okay.
Again, the point here that's so important is the importance, and if Melissa Metz-Hall was here, she'd talk about her dissertation work on how important it is to look at practice together in a video recording. Mm-hmm. And so the whole notion here is to kind of invite our leader candidates to use this strategy in their coaching, and hopefully they'll hang on to it as a strategy moving forward into employment, right? That going in and observing a teacher, that's nice. But really, if you video record the practice and then look at it together and talk about it, both people can really then engage, the teacher being recorded and the coach, because you can stop the video and you can say, see right here when John left his chair and whatever, right? So that's the point. The point is using video as a way to coach is so important.
Okay.
And we don't want to trip up our candidates. So until we get our guide really clear, we can't hold them to doing it during that 10 minutes, but we're hoping to move there in the future. So this year, if they talk about it and they talk about watching it together and it comes in and informs their conversation, they are good to go. Or if we see them looking at it together during that 10 minutes of clip, great, even better. Now we've got that evidence. So either way is okay. And we want to be supportive of our candidates, so we're not going to not score something. But we do need to know that there's some verbal reference, or in the annotation there's a reference, or they're actually doing it. All of that is going to be okay.
Perfect. That's so much more clear. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much.
Yeah.
Right. And I think Linda was next.
Oh.
Hi, Linda.
Hello.
Hi.
Hi, Gay. Miss you. I have two. One's a clarifying question, and one is actually going off the point we were just discussing. I'm aware, and I'm real focused on the fact that they're collecting data around the CSTP element and all of that. Part of the conversation that I'm not hearing a little bit, and so I just want to clarify this, is it needs to be related to the learner objective that this teacher started to at the beginning. I mean, all is in, if we're doing all of this over here, but not achieving the learner objective and the student work product related to that, I guess my clarifying question comes around if they are using a data collection tool that, you know, specific to the CSTP, but maybe also in addition taking low inference notes, or the low inference notes are related specifically to the CSTP, but they see missed opportunities or something else related to the objective. Are they not to give you that data because it wasn't specific just to this one CSTP element? Does my question make sense?
Well, I mean, I think it just depends, right? The point is to shine a light on the CSTP element, and the element is pretty broad. If there are other things captured, that's fine. You know, and no one's going to care about more than. It's just that we were seeing running records, basically. We were seeing scripting coming in as observation tools. And it never talked at all about the CSTP element. It was just, you know, it just was a bunch of nonsense. And so we're like, look, focus it on the one element and learn how to collect evidence and observation about one thing, right? These are people new to observation and collection of data. Let's look at one thing. Let's collect data about it. Then let's talk about it. So that's the underlying idea. And I'm so sorry, my friends, I'm being called into another meeting. I need to leave you in the great hands of Gay Roby and Lori Thornley. They will help you. And I'm out of here. I got to get on to my other meeting before I get in trouble. So thank you so much and good luck, and come talk to us on Thursdays. Bye.
Great, thank you. My last clarifying question, because somebody had written a comment that had asked, and I thought this was not acceptable. So maybe this can be clarified. I believe the question that was asked on the chat was, could somebody in the program serve as the volunteer teacher for somebody else who's in the program? And I thought that that wasn't an acceptable thing. Or has that changed?
As Marco said, and then Amy wrote, we really ask that they look to a volunteer teacher who has some experience in the classroom. But there is nothing in the guidelines that say that you cannot use that. We still frown upon it. It's not the best issue. Okay. So avoid when possible.
Okay, I knew there had been some questions about that when they were with their PLC groups. And so many of them are teachers, who are in the classroom right now. And so I did not think that was something that was acceptable, but it sounds like it's not that it's not, but it's not advised. Mm-hmm. Okay.
It's easily said, right?
Okay. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions? I'm not seeing any hands raised. Does anyone want to unmute themselves?
Yeah, we're down to just a few people. So if you have any remaining questions, you can unmute and fire away. Josie, are you good? Josie's gone. Victoria, Liz, Denise. Hi, Joe. I think we may be good.
We may be good. Thank you all so much for attending. We'll catch you next time around.